Ever heard about exploding seashells?
Exploding seashells.
Yeah, exploding seashells.
Yours.
Or vanishing poison cigars.
Sounds more like a Bond film than real life.
That's what I thought too. But this was real life. Today we're taking a deep dive into the Cold War. Well, more specifically, the CIA's attempts to take down Fidel Castro.
Ah, Castro.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a figure shrouded in intrigue and, well, just plain bizarre stories.
It really is a fascinating case study, the lengths they went to.
The sheer paranoia of that era
Exactly.
boggles the mind.
Yeah. So to guide us through this, we're using an episode of the Redacted Declassified Mystery podcast.
Okay.
It's called, get this, 634 Ways to Kill Castro.
634 ways.
634, and they're not exaggerating. They go into detail on so many of them.
I mean, you gotta admit, it makes you wonder, was Castro really that big of a threat, or did it become an obsession?
Well, that's something we'll be exploring today. What makes it even more interesting is that, Castro wasn't always this villain in the eyes of the U.S.
Right. You know, in the early days, he was actually quite popular, seen as this charismatic revolutionary.
A bit of a media darling, you could say.
I'm talking like during his 1959 New York trip, the press loved him. Everyone was clamoring to hear him speak. Wild, huh?
Yeah, the podcast talks about that shift, like almost a complete 180 in how he was perceived. So what happened? What was the turning point?
I think a lot of it has to do with his alliance with the Soviet Union.
The big red flag for the U.S.
Exactly. And then you've got his decision to nationalize Cuban industries.
Which many of them were American-owned.
So naturally, U.S. business interests were not happy.
That's got to be when the CIA decided they needed to deal with the Castro problem.
And that's where Operation Mongoose comes in.
Operation Mongoose.
That was the CIA's code name for this whole massive undertaking.
So are we talking like full-on regime change they're aiming for?
Well, it involved a whole lot of things. Discrediting Castro, undermining him, and, yeah, more drastic measures, too.
Okay, let's dive into some of these early schemes. The podcast mentioned LSD at one point, right? What was that all about?
Oh, yeah, the LSD thing. They actually tried to sabotage one of his radio broadcasts. The idea was to, lace the studio with LSD, make him sound completely incoherent on the air.
I mean, that sounds so crazy. Like, who came up with that?
Desperate times, I guess. But yeah, as you might imagine, it didn't quite pan out the way they hoped.
Okay, so we've got LSD, and then there's the whole thing about trying to make Castro's beard fall out.
Ah, yes, the depilatory plot. They were convinced that his beard was like the symbol of his power.
So their thinking was, take away the beard, you take away the power.
Something like that. They even thought about using thallium salts. Stuff that can cause hair loss.
Thallium salts.
Yeah. I mean, looking back, some of these schemes seem almost comical.
They really do. But it makes you wonder, did they ever actually try to, assassinate him?
Oh, they did. And trust me, those attempts were even more elaborate. And in some cases, even more bizarre. Like, for instance, you've got the story of Marita Lorenz. Castro's former lover. She got recruited by the CIA.
Wow. Okay, so we're already in spy novel territory here.
Right. And it gets wilder. So they cooked up this plan to poison him with pills. They were supposed to be hidden in a jar of cold cream.
Cold cream?
Yeah. She got the pills into his hotel room, but apparently they melted. Plan foiled by melted pills.
I can't make this stuff up.
But here's the kicker. Castro finds out about the plot, right? And what does he do? He hands her a gun. Like, straight up, gives her a gun. And the chance to kill him right then and there.
No way.
According to Lorenz, yeah. Talk about a high-pressure situation.
So what did she do?
She couldn't bring herself to do it. Apparently, still had feelings for him despite everything.
Oh, wow. It's a good reminder that these operations, they weren't just like games. They involved real people, real emotion.
Absolutely. And, it highlights how complex Castro was as a figure. He had this charisma, this ability to forge these, intense connections with people.
But that charisma aside, he was also known for being incredibly shrewd. And his security was notoriously tight.
Oh, absolutely. He was very aware that he was a target, always changing his routines, his travel plans, even had a food taster, to prevent poisoning.
Smart move. So even if they couldn't take him out directly, did the CIA manage to discredit him with these early schemes? Did any of them actually work?
It's tough to say for sure. Some argue that these attempts, even the failed ones, contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion around him.
But they didn't achieve their main goal.
Yeah.
Getting rid of him.
Nope. Not even close.
And in fact, as we'll see, some of those attempts may have actually had the opposite effect.
Strengthen his image in the long run, you could say.
That's what we'll be exploring as we go deeper into this story.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure.
Stay tuned.
You'd think they would have given up after a while.
Right.
But no, it seems like the more the CIA failed, the more obsessed they became with taking Castro down.
And the crazier the ideas got.
Oh, absolutely. They went full-blown, like, spy movie territory.
Which brings us back to those exploding seashells.
Ah!
That's when things really start to sound like a bad Bond villain plot.
You gotta give them points for creativity, I guess.
Well, maybe not the best kind of creativity.
You know, the mastermind behind that one was a CIA guy named Cornelius Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. Any relation to the president?
Turns out he was a distant relative of Teddy Roosevelt.
Wow, small world.
Right. And apparently this guy, Cornelius, had a real knack for these outlandish spy gadgets.
So what was the logic behind the exploding seashell? Were they seriously picturing Castro just, like, casually picking it up on the beach?
Not quite. Castro was a big fan of spearfishing.
Spearfishing, okay.
So the plan was to plant this, like, cleverly disguised explosive among the coral reefs where he liked to dive.
I mean, that just seems so dangerous.
You're telling me.
What if some innocent person stumbled upon it?
Yeah, it was a recipe for disaster, and thankfully it never actually went beyond the planning stage.
Okay, but the exploding seashells weren't the only wacky idea, right? Didn't they also try to come up with a poison wetsuit?
Oh, yeah, the poison wetsuit, another one of Cornelius's brilliant ideas.
So how was that one supposed to work?
The plan was to line the wetsuit with a fungus that would cause a debilitating skin disease.
A fungus?
Yeah, they even considered using a diving suit contaminated with tuberculosis bacteria at one point.
It's like they were trying to come up with the most outlandish, most horrible way to get rid of him.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But, you know, amidst all these crazy schemes, there were also some plots that were far more serious and meticulously planned.
You're talking about the poison cigars, right? The ones Dr. Edward Gunn worked on.
Exactly. Dr. Gunn was a CIA scientist, and he was basically their go-to guy for all things poison.
So he was like a real-life Q from James Bond, except instead of cool gadgets, he was making deadly toxins.
Pretty much. He developed all sorts of poisons that could be used to eliminate Castro.
So what was so special about these cigars?
They were infused with botulinum toxin, a super potent neurotoxin.
Botulinum toxin.
Yeah. One puff of that and it's game over.
That's terrifying.
The plan was for Castro to light up the cigar, inhale the toxin, and, well, you know the rest.
So did they ever actually get the cigars to Castro?
They did, or at least they got close. The cigars were prepared, packaged, and delivered to a CIA asset in Cuba.
So Castro was inches away from lighting up one of these deadly cigars.
We'll never know for sure because the cigars vanished.
Vanished? Like, what do you mean?
They just disappeared. No trace, no explanation.
Do we know what happened? Did the asset get cold feet? Were they intercepted?
It's one of those mysteries that'll probably never be solved.
So the poison cigars were a bust, but the CIA wasn't done yet.
They had one more trick up their sleeve, a more subtle approach this time.
You're talking about the poison pen plot, right?
That's the one.
That's one where they were going to use a former Cuban military leader who would become a CIA informant.
Right. The plan was for him to get close to Castro and use this seemingly ordinary pen to inject him with poison.
So it's like a pen with a hidden needle.
Exactly. A tiny needle filled with a lethal dose of poison. It seemed foolproof, or at least as foolproof as these things can be.
But something happened, didn't it? Something that threw a wrench in their plans.
You guessed it. The Kennedy assassination.
Oh, wow. That's right. It happened on the same day that the poison pen was delivered to the CIA asset in Cuba. Right? Talk about a turning point in history.
It sent shockwaves through the U.S. government, the world, really.
So how did it directly affect the Castro plots?
Well, there were immediate concerns about retaliation, about the stability of the U.S. government, all sorts of chaos and uncertainty.
And I imagine the Cuban asset who was supposed to use the poison pen probably wasn't too keen on being involved in anything that might be seen as a response to Kennedy's assassination.
You're right. The political climate had changed drastically overnight.
And they ultimately decided to abandon the poison pen plot.
It was just too risky, too politically charged.
It's like even when they had these meticulously crafted plans, something always seemed to get in the way.
It makes you wonder, was Castro just incredibly lucky? Or was there something more at play?
Maybe it was a combination of both.
We'll delve into those questions and explore the ultimate outcome of this cat and mouse game in the next part of our deep dive.
You know, it's really amazing to think about just how much time and effort the CIA poured into these operations.
Millions of dollars, countless man-hours, all for nothing.
And you got to wonder, did they ever stop and think maybe their approach was the problem?
Right, like maybe trying to outsmart Castro at every turn was actually making him stronger?
Because he was no dummy? He was a brilliant strategist in his own right.
Exactly. He'd already outsmarted Batista, taken control of a country. He wasn't going to be easily fooled by some exploding seashells or a poison pen.
So in a way, Castro's survival was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the CIA tried to get him in secret.
The more he became this symbol of defiance.
Like he was untouchable.
The guy who couldn't be killed by the most powerful nation on Earth.
And that image really played into his propaganda, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It gave him this aura of invincibility.
So after all those years, all those plots, Castro died of natural causes in 2016.
90 years old, died peacefully in his sleep.
Kind of anticlimactic, isn't it?
After all that drama and intrigue, huh?
It makes you think about what the CIA actually accomplished with all those years of trying to kill him.
I mean, did they really achieve anything beyond solidifying his image?
And turning him into a martyr for some?
It's a question historians still debate today.
What a wild story, though.
It really is.
It shows just how complex history can be.
And how actions, even those taken in secret, can have far-reaching consequences.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of critical thinking.
Especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism of a story like this.
But we need to dig deeper.
Question the narratives we're being fed.
Consider different perspectives.
And be wary of those who offer simple solutions to complex problems.
Because history is rarely simple.
Right. It's messy, it's full of contradictions, and it's important to remember that real people are at the heart of these events.
Not just political figures.
But also the individuals who were recruited for these operations, their families, the innocent bystanders who got caught in the crossfire.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names. It's about human stories, choices, and the ripple effects that continue to shape our world.
This story also raises questions about the limits of power.
Even with all its resources, the CIA couldn't eliminate Castro.
And it makes you wonder if those resources had been directed towards diplomacy, towards understanding the root causes of the conflict.
Could things have turned out differently?
It's a question worth pondering.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the CIA's attempts to kill Castro.
I hope our listeners will walk away with a greater understanding of just how complex this period of history really was.
And how important it is to question assumptions.
To seek out multiple perspectives.
And to be wary of simple explanations for complex events. So if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating and often unsettling world of Cold War espionage, we highly recommend checking out the Redacted Declassified Mysteries podcast.
It's a great resource for anyone who wants to delve deeper into these real-life spy stories.
We'd also love to hear your thoughts on this story. What surprised you the most?
What questions did it raise for you about the Cold War and how it continues to shape our world today?
You can share your insights with us on social media. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.